spot where you get that. It might be on your deck, it might be in your front yard, it might be where you would say, oh, I wanted to put a garden there. We don't always get to put the garden where we want it to go because it just doesn't match up. Okay? Think again about how close is it to the house. Why would we want it close to the house?
Keep the beasties away.
Keep the beasts away. Okay, absolutely. So most critters are not going to come up on your front porch. They might, but hopefully not. Why else would we keep it to the house?
Convenience.
So you can get to it, so you can pay attention to it, right? Water it, weed it. You wouldn't need weeds here, but watering is still essential. Any raised bed garden will usually use more water than an in-ground garden because it's being kept from all sides with air. So therefore, it may need to be watered a little bit more frequently. Anyone ever plant a garden in the spring and then you go out in the fall and say, oh, I wonder what grew? And really haven't paid attention to it for the middle 2 months? And then you say, where on earth did the garden go, right? You're not going to get much that way. You have to tend your garden continuously. It means look for critters. Maybe there's slugs or bugs that we need to squish. Maybe there's tomato hornworm that we need to get rid of. We need to be paying attention to all of these things to know what is in our garden to make sure that we're taking care of it. Drainage is really important. We'll talk about soil in a second. It doesn't really matter what you have for soil because we're not using it. But the puddles are really important. What do you have for drainage? So when all the snow melts this spring, look and see where the big puddles are and do not put your garden there. Okay? If your existing garden area has lots of big puddles in it, you might want to consider bringing in some more garden soil to build up that area, because if it is really wet, your roots will just rot, which means you won't get a good quality plant. Okay? So the drainage is really important. And the soil, as I said, what you have doesn't currently matter, because in a square foot garden, you start from scratch, which is how we get the weed-free option there. We create our own soil with 3 basic components we'll talk about in a second, and start from nothing. I have turned a couple of raised bed gardens that I had into square foot gardens and have not replaced the soil. So I have 2 20 by 2 gardens that I've made into square foot gardens. The soil in there is a soil that's always been in there. They're probably the most weed-filled gardens I've ever seen. Okay, and I can't get rid of the weeds. I've tried, I pick, I weed, I can't get them out of the soil. But to do the investment of changing all that soil over, it's just not worth it to me. So I've amended the soil, I add compost to it, but I am not going to change over all of the soil that I currently have. So that's an option that you can also take if you already have an existing garden. Any questions so far? Am I going too fast? Slow? Okay. This is Mel, Rookie Mel, okay, and his showpiece gardens. If you ever happen to be in Ogden, Utah, make sure you go here, okay? I don't know why anyone would go to Ogden, Utah, but I'm sure there's something there where people go there for. He has acres and acres of examples, experiments, let's try this, and you name it, he has a garden shaped like it, okay? So this is examples of some of his gardens that he has. He now has gone, he went from just teaching the method to now really selling everything to do with the method, which I think sometimes detracts from the message of what you're trying to teach. But now he sells the gardens, he sells the soil, he sells kits and structures, and all of them are astronomically expensive. Okay, so I would generally say just look and see what you can find locally. Find it around your house if possible. It will be much cheaper. The 10 components of a square foot garden are here, and we're going to go through each one. Some are very easy, saying just do it. Others might take a little bit of time, okay? In terms of like planting, that will take a couple extra seconds. But some of the other ones are very easy, and I just say, just harvest. When it looks like it's ready to pick, you pick it, okay? So some of them are quite simple to do. The first one is the layout. Now remember, in a traditional garden, we go out and we say, okay, there's a box. How many rows could I put in it? I put a row here, I put a row here, I put a row here. I might be able to squeeze a tomato plant in up in the corner. But in terms of square foot gardening, we do not think of rows, we think of squares. So you take a 4x4 garden and you put a grid on it, which we'll talk about in a second, but instead of just one garden, we now have 16 individual gardens, okay, because this is per square foot. So in a 4x4, you get 16 potential gardens. Each garden, you can have the potential for 16 plants. So someone did the math for me yesterday, I don't remember what they came out with, but 16 times 16 is a lot, right? I didn't remember what the numbers are, but you can get a lot of potential crop out of a small little space. And that's really the beauty of square foot gardening, is that you can do a lot of different things, because really the potentials are endless. You have a single garden for every square foot. You can plant something different in every square foot. We do a 4x4 box pretty much for every adult in the family if you're looking for 1 salad per day, basically, for the summer. If you're looking at canning, preserving, harvesting, freezing, any of those sorts of things, then we're going to plant extra gardens. I have, I think, 6 4x4s now and 2 2x20s. I plant a lot of stuff. My children will only eat food that's out in the garden. They won't eat it if I bring it in the house. So I plant them their own garden that they pick from, okay? And that is a lovely tip for those of you who have children or take care of children, that if you want them to eat their vegetables, have them plant something. Because they're much more likely to eat something that they've planted and watch grow than if you say, oh, here, eat your green beans. My kids will go eating 4 pounds of green beans outside, dirty and gross, and if I bring them in, they won't touch them. So it's all a matter of perspective sometimes. So children typically are 3x3. If you say, you know what, we really don't even eat that many vegetables, 1 4x4 might be enough for your whole family. So kind of play around with it. You don't have to go out and do your entire backyard in square foot gardens. You might want to start with a couple buckets or a swimming pool to see how it comes out the first time. So again, the planting space, we'll talk about what these things are in a second, but this would be a large plant, 1 plant per square foot. Medium, 4 plants per square foot. Small would be 9, and extra small would be 16. Okay, so depending on the plant variety, which I gave in your second packet, which I'm not going to go through, but that one that has his picture on the front, that has all the math in it that you will ever need to know, for gardening at least. So if you're saying, well, how many green beans go in a square foot? You look at the chart on the front page, it says green beans 9. Okay, so you don't even have to figure out with the instructions on the back side of the packet. Why would we do a 4x4 box? Why would we do that size?
Easy to reach around.
Absolutely, it's easy to reach around. And Mel actually went out with a measuring tape and measured the tallest man's arm he could find and the smallest woman's arm he could find, and said, well, how far could you reach? And it was 2 feet. Everyone can pretty much reach 2 feet. If for some reason you have a shoulder injury, back injury that does not allow you to reach that 2 feet, we would make it just smaller. Okay? Because what we don't want to do is have people standing in the middle of the garden, because what's that going to do? Compact the soil. Okay? In our house, if you step in garden, I always tell my kids, if you step in my garden, you will drop dead. And they haven't tried it yet, but I tell anybody else that too. And I have balance on the edges, trying to get somewhere versus walking around. Just walk around. It's not that big. Okay? Get a little bit of exercise. But that's why a 4x4 garden is ideal, because you can get in from any side and reach any spot within that garden. Versus a traditional garden where you might be straddling a couple of rows and bending and twisting and trying to, create some crazy moves to get to the plant that's way over here that you just can't quite reach. In terms of the boxes, again, this is a 4x4 box. You can make them longer, skinnier. You can put trellises up on the back. We'll talk about that in a second. But you can grow anything here, whether it be pumpkin, squash, zucchini, you name it, you can grow it in this garden. The key thing is to trellis any vines up and out. If you plant a vine plant right in the center, what's going to happen to everything around it? Right? It's going to be strangled out. It's not going to work. So you have to think about placement as well. 6 inches of soil is all you need. So these boxes, my boxes, I think I had lumber at my house. I think it was 10 inches, 10-inch lumber, but they're not full to the top with soil. I only put 6 inches of soil in, because that's all you need to have a plant grow well. Even the largest plant will grow in 6 inches of soil. Have you ever pulled something up from a traditional garden and had the root system be like really huge? Why would a root system be that big?
Looking for water.
Looking for water, looking for nutrients. Okay? If you provide the plant everything it needs in 6 inches of soil, it will not go down further than that. If you don't, that's when it starts really putting a lot of energy into going down, seeking water, seeking nutrients. And if your plant is putting energy into rooting, it is not putting energy into fruiting. So that is not what we want. Okay? We want the fruiting versus the rooting. So 6 inches of soil is all we need. And again, the lumber can be anything. I don't recommend pressure-treated wood. Technically, it's fine. I'm skeptical about everything. Okay? I wouldn't use it, just because it does have chemicals in it. Cedar would be ideal because it will last longer. It is going to be more expensive. You can buy plastic boards, you can buy plastic kits that last a little bit longer, but again, it's plastic, and what do you make sure it's not BPA in the plastic. Tires are out. Do not use tires in gardening ever, unless it's a flower. Okay? Just because when tires heat up, notice how they smell. And when they smell, their chemicals are leaching into the soil. If something is leaching into the soil, it's leaching into your vegetables, which means you're eating it. I can't remember how many thousands of chemicals are in a tire, but it's something like 70,000 chemicals create a tire, which we don't want to eat most of them.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
can you go back to the bottom one,
Absolutely.
the barrier?
Yes, this one would be just a cold frame here.
I'm
So you
sorry,
would be
it'll
able-
hold the soil above the ground, so we need a weed.
Oh, yeah, the barrier, absolutely, underneath the ground, okay. If you're putting it on top of existing soil or a spot where there is weeds or grass, you want a barrier between there, otherwise it will just keep growing up through your garden. Okay, so what you want to do there is, you can use landscape fabric, thick landscape fabric. I use cardboard because it is readily accessible and biodegrades and creates a fantastic weed barrier. So underneath all my gardens, which I'll show you in a second, but pretty much the entire garden area has a good 1.5 to 2 inches of cardboard down underneath all of my beds, because once that starts and it will create drainage, the water will go through there, and over time it will biodegrade, but over that time, all the weeds have been killed off underneath it. So by the time it biodegrades, there's nothing left, really, for weeds to come up through.
Can you use newspaper?
You can absolutely use newspaper. I don't recommend you use like the shiny glossy newspaper that adds and inserts, but any of the others is completely fine. And the ink in newspaper is actually a plant-based ink, so it's completely biodegradable as well. The ones with the shiny paper tend to have more chemicals in the paper process, so that's why I don't use those typically. Plastic, we might think plastic would be a good thing to create a barrier, but it won't create drainage.
So is that the difference then between the raised beds and the square foot gardening concept?
Not the raised beds, you can make a raised bed into a square foot garden just as easy. The big difference between a raised bed and a square foot garden is going to be the grade, which we're going to talk about in a second. That's going to be the only big difference.
Okay, and the next question is you talk about putting it on a deck.
Yes,
What do I do?
for drainage.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point to think about. And this is with any container. With any container gardening that you're going to put up on your deck, you're still going to have to count for drainage. Whether it be a bucket, whether it be a pot, whether it be anything. A good rule of thumb is if it's a foot-wide pot, you need at least a good 1/2 inch drainage in the bottom, 1/2 inch hole in the bottom to get good drainage. And typically, what we see is people get these big planters, they fill them up with soil, and the bottom is really heavy of mud. Okay, that's all you've created there because there's not enough drainage. So with a square foot garden, if it's up on a deck or a table, you're going to have to drill a hole for every square foot, and then watch what